This video is part one of the series on chapter 2 of Government in America on the Constitution. When colonists from the British Isles came over to North America and set up colonies up and down the Atlantic coast, for the most part, the British government left them alone, and they liked it that way. That started to change in the middle of the 1700s when the North American colonies of different European countries got involved in the bigger European wars that were going on at the time. So what in the United States we often refer to as the French and Indian War was part of a larger European conflict, also called the 7 Years' War. And so in order to defend the colonies from attackers from other countries, other colonies, the British government had to spend a lot of money and send troops in order to help keep things together, which meant that after the war was over, the British government had a lot of debt and a lot of money that it had to pay off. And it figured, well, we got into this debt and spent this money because we were helping out the colonists. They should be able to pay some of it back. So they started getting more involved and raising more taxes. And you've probably heard about taxation without representation and all of those things that started getting the colonists thinking, maybe we don't so much want to be with the British Empire anymore. Maybe we want to set out on our own. So as the leaders in the colonies sort of developed this idea, and after some fighting had already broken out between American militias and the British military, the leaders of the colonies got together and said, yeah, you know what, we're going to go for it. We're going to move ahead. We're going to try and make a go of this as an independent country. So they kind of had to explain themselves, not just to Britain, but to the other colonists and to the other nations of the world that they were going to ask for support. So they decided that they were going to officially declare that they were independent. They were going to write a document, which we now know as the Declaration of Independence, which was written largely by Thomas Jefferson with input from some other people. Now, even though the Declaration of Independence is a very famous document in the United States and people quote it and talk about it, it's important to remember that it's not actually a law. It doesn't have any binding force or require anybody to do anything. Today it's just a declaration. It's a statement of what the colonies and their leaders believed in at the time and why they felt independence was a good idea. And so it's useful to look at the Declaration because the ideas that influence the Declaration would also influence the actual government that those leaders would have to set up later on. And so we're going to try and connect the dots and connect the threads a little bit between the Declaration and the actual governing documents. Again, a little bit of background here. Jefferson was influenced, as were many of the American founders, by a group of European thinkers and their ideas, which came from a period known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period where a lot of people started thinking about, can we use our intellect? Can we use our reason to work out better ways of dealing with the world? Instead of relying on tradition or superstition or religion, can we think our way to a better world? Can we think our way to a better world through science? Can we think our way to a better world through better government? And especially with the politics and the economic factors, the the Enlightenment had a lot of influence on the framers, on Jefferson, and on the nation that the United States would become. Now, one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment on the American government was a man named John Locke, who wrote a number of texts, but the one that we want to focus on here is his second treatise on government, which kind of laid out a lot of ideas that would be very familiar to anyone who knows the Declaration of Independence or in the American Constitution. Now, Locke's basic idea is that no human being is born with the right to rule a bunch of other human beings. There's nothing special about kings or emperors or dukes or princes or whatever that means that the rest of us have to listen to these people. And back during Locke's day, a lot of people believed that. They believed that God or the heavens or the universe had sort of picked certain people, certain families, and they were going to be the ones with power, and everybody else was sort of stuck at a lower station. And Locke wanted to work against that. So he said that really every person is born with certain freedoms, certain rights, and no ruler can take those away. They're part of us. They're part of who we are. It's human nature for us to have certain basic rights, and these basic rights are known as our natural rights. And the basic ones are: we have the right to live, we have the right to be free, and we have the right to try to make something of our lives, and pursue the things that we want to do, try and make our lives better through our own efforts. These are some of the basic natural rights that Locke says our government should be preserving, and that idea wound up being very influential to Thomas Jefferson. So, how does the government go about preserving our right to life, our right to liberty? The idea is that we make an agreement in society. The ruler and the ruled are part of a deal, which we can refer to as the social contract. The ruler is supposed to agree to protect the rights of the people. How do I know that my right to life is going to be preserved? Because the government is taking steps to make sure that it's not too dangerous for me, that there's some law and some order in society. And in exchange for the government using its power to protect me and protect my rights, I'm willing to listen to what the government says and follow its rules. But again, this is not a do whatever the king says just because the king said so. The king has to be within certain limits, along the lines of doing what the people need in order for their rights to be preserved. If the king or the ruler isn't doing that, isn't looking out for the people, then the people have the right to say, we're done. We're not going to follow you anymore. It's time for a new government. So this is the very new idea that Locke is introducing, that the power of the ruler is not total, it's not absolute, it's limited. And the government keeps that power because the ruled, the people, agree to it. That's a notion that's called the consent of the governed. And when the people don't have that, don't give that consent anymore, then the government is no longer legitimate. And that's what the Declaration of Independence was. The Declaration of Independence was the Americans setting out the reasons why they would no longer consent to be governed by the British government, why they felt that the British government had stepped over the limits, was no longer protecting the rights of the people, and as such, a new government needed to be formed. So that's the basic idea, the idea that people should not be governed by an all-powerful government, and that the government needs to be looking out for the people. That's the idea that a group of Americans sought independence for and ultimately achieved. The question would then become, okay, now what do we do with our independence? How do we set up a government that meets these ideals? That's what we'll discuss in the next video. For now, I will leave you with these questions for further thought.